Chapter 1887 King Arthur's Sword. Gawain could not stand Fatty Sue's mouse-like fighting style. He found it meaningless. Just as cold light meets the sun, ice and snow can only be melted in the presence of the sun. His right hand reached into the sun, and the next moment, he took out a flaming spear more than 3 meters long. Aiming in the direction of Fatty Sue, Gawain drew his bow back like the full moon. "Keep running. Let's see if you can dodge this strike." Eclipse Spear. The spear flew out of his hand, meeting the brilliance of the sun, blindingly bright and making it hard to see. Fatty Sue looked up at the sky, unable to keep his eyes from narrowing as he felt something approaching. But the spear and the sun had already merged into one in his eyes, making it impossible to see. By the time the scorching gust of wind hit, the eclipse spear was less than 100 meters away from him. His eternal ice domain was not very effective at delaying this kind of point-to-point attack. By the time Fatty Sue tried to dodge, it had already reached his face. Whoa! The sound of flames cutting through the air was heard right next to Fatty Sue's ear. Fortunately, the 2 years of rigorous training had given his body the instinct to avoid danger. At the last minute, he dodged, and tumbled 5 or 6 times on the ground, looking a little disheveled. After the eclipse spear pierced the ice, a golden flash suddenly erupted. A huge golden sphere of flame formed, and most of the heavy frost armor on Fatty Sue's body was melted away. The fire licked his body mercilessly. It was entirely thanks to the kinetic energy provided by the armor that Fatty Sue managed to scurry out of the range of the fireball. He managed to stand unsteadily on the ground, gasping for breath. His legs were a little sore and felt as heavy as lead. His attributes were suppressed, and it was indeed difficult to fight. But before he could rest, Gawain's second shot of the eclipse spear was already aimed at him. Fatty Sue's face turned pale, and this time his body did not have time to dodge. He gritted his teeth and raised the 9-toothed rake in his hand. The power of ice and frost exploded, and the blue frost on the 9-toothed rake nearly doubled in thickness. It was slammed towards the eclipsing spear. The eclipsing spear, burning with a raging flame, collided with the frost-covered 9-toothed rake in front of Fatty Sue. The next moment, the flames and shards splattered in all directions like feathers in the wind. The battle between Zhang Yi and King Arthur continued. King Arthur became more and more alarmed as he fought. He had never imagined that the chaos, in the intelligence, which played a wretched style of play and only knew to hide behind the space formed by the dimensional gate and fight others using all kinds of strange methods, would be so powerful. Ichigard's armor and divine refinement's sword could only provide him with defense and attack values that were not inferior to King Arthur's. But the ferocious and unparalleled skill with the sword and mastery of martial arts could not have been cultivated overnight. Zhang Yi is so fast. He is like a black storm. King Arthur's sword has also formed countless afterimages in the sky. The fierce battle between the two is like a dream in this space between heaven and sea, with illusory light and shadows. Zhang Yi was now filled with excitement. He could see 4 different futures unfolding in his mind's eye within the next 4 seconds, depending on the choice he made. Each attack was extremely tricky, making it difficult for King Arthur to defend against. He was waiting for an opportunity, or rather, he was still hesitating as to whether or not to use the skill, Blink in the Sky. Once this move was used, it would definitely cause huge damage to himself. Therefore, if he could not end the battle with one move, then using it would only lead to his own defeat. There was also a very crucial point. Since this was not a life-or-death duel, was it necessary to give the opponent the opportunity to understand his own abilities? This thought flashed through his mind for a split second, and the next moment, Zhang Yi had to respond to King Arthur's sword with all his strength. It was a king's sword, from 600 years ago, from King Arthur's ancestor, Count Levant. Gorgeous gems were inlaid on the sword, and the blade was made of the most advanced Damascus steel of the time. This was not a powerful weapon, but in the hands of King Arthur, even a twig would become the sharpest sword in the world. The power of a king conquers all. The oppressive power of the king's authority indiscriminately weakened Zhang Yi's overall attribute power. But Zhang Yi, who could see the future, naturally had enough means to avoid his attacks. The black magic sword swept out, and a dark energy suddenly erupted, colliding fiercely with King Arthur's sword. The sword pressure that symbolizes the authority of the king and the void that symbolizes destruction split the sky and earth in half, one half bright, the other half dark. The huge energy fluctuation made both men recoil. They had to take a moment to rest, to relieve the at least tens of thousands of crazy attacks that had taken place in the short span of 2 minutes. Both men's brains were a bit chaotic, and their blood was constantly churning. Zhang Yi shook his head. He needed to calculate a large number of future possibilities, and he could not even do it in advance at the moment of every sword strike. He glanced at himself and saw that there was a shallow scratch on his armor on the left side of his waist and back. That was left by the tip of King Arthur's sword. If it weren't for the protection of the Ichigard armor, such an attack would have torn Zhang Yi's body apart. I have armor and you have a sword sheath, so it's fair. Zhang Yi looked at King Arthur in the distance and said indifferently. His Sword of Kings also blocked several of Zhang Yi's fierce attacks. At this moment, the two understood one thing in their hearts. In terms of close combat alone, if it were not a life-or-death struggle, it would be difficult for the two to continue fighting and determine a winner. Relatively speaking, King Arthur felt a little more suppressed. This situation was formed because he used the conch shell horn to seal Zhang Yi's space ability. What if Zhang Yi could use his space ability? Zhang Yi felt everything that was happening in the 3 battlefields in the distance. He suddenly smiled and said to King Arthur, "You see, they are rooting for us." Zhang Yi suddenly tilted his head, and the rabid dog helmet on his head looked eerie and hideous. "Do you think your men are stronger, or do you think my friends are stronger?" King Arthur said without the slightest hesitation, "Of course my men are better. The members of the Knights of the Round Table are all elites with aristocratic blood flowing through their veins. I'm not telling you that being an aristocrat is necessarily noble. I'm telling you that their ancestors were all people who had gained supreme honor through war and killing. And the spirit of their ancestors inspires them to fight for glorious glory on the battlefield of the new era." King Arthur's body bent slightly as he looked for a weak spot in the Ichigard armor. This armor was the culmination of mechanical civilization, but it was just armor, and it was impossible for it to be flawless. At the same time, his heart was also on guard against Zhang Yi's move that had instantly killed Morana, Blink in the Sky. Zhang Yi didn't want to really fight to the death with King Arthur. But if the battle really develops in that direction, I'm afraid it won't be in the control of the two of them. The risk of using Blink in the Sky is too great. As for the even more dangerous sin of blasphemy, which hurts the user before hurting the opponent, it can only be used if one can use the dimensional gate to absorb the opponent's power. So right now, what Zhang Yi needs is the key ability to kill in a duel. He glanced at the black magic sword formed by the divine refinement, and a plan came to mind. "King Arthur, if we continue fighting like this, I'm afraid someone will really lose their life." Zhang Yi said to King Arthur with a smile, "Why don't we try a different way of fighting?" King Arthur straightened up. "Oh, what do you have in mind?" Zhang Yi spread his left hand and said, "Since this is a gentleman's duel as agreed, why don't we follow the tradition of duels in your Britannia? Each side attacks in turn, while the other side can only adopt a defensive stance. However, in order to quickly end the battle, I suggest that from now on, each of us attack 3 times in turn, until one side falls. As for who goes first, we'll decide by tossing a coin." King Arthur bowed his head and thought for a moment, then smiled and nodded in agreement. "This is indeed a very good suggestion. In this way, neither of our sides will get out of control and actually cause someone to be injured or killed." Everyone knew that the other party was hiding some powerful trump cards. They were the kind of tricks that, once used, could get out of control. Zhang Yi's proposal was indeed the safest way to play. "Then, I'll flip the coin." Zhang Yi took a golden coin directly from dimensional space and was about to flip it when King Arthur reached out to stop him. "Wait. You proposed the rules, so naturally I should flip the coin. Isn't that right?" King Arthur was not stupid. Theoretically, coin tossing was fair, but there were naturally tricks involved. Everyone knew that the person who acted first had the advantage. Because the person on the defensive could not fight back, they could only passively take the attack. Zhang Yi narrowed his eyes, and his voice spread out through the helmet. Then, let's flip it together. King Arthur was puzzled by the meaning, so Zhang Yi flicked his thumb, and the gold coin in his hand shot up into the sky like a bullet. He took out a pistol in his left hand and aimed it at the air. I guess it's head first. King Arthur immediately understood what Zhang Yi meant and took out a gun as well. Then I'll guess it's written side up. The two of them simultaneously fired at the coin. The trajectory of the gold coin kept changing under the two men's fire, flying around in midair, and finally landing in tatters on the sea. Although it was in tatters, the numbers on it could still be seen. King Arthur smiled and said to Zhang Yi, "It seems that I get to go first." Zhang Yi shrugged helplessly, "You're right, so you go first." "That's what I want," Zhang Yi said to himself. Because if he went first, he might resort to extreme measures to ensure that he could defeat King Arthur in the first round. It was possible to kill the opponent. However, in terms of defense, he was confident that he could control his strength. Zhang Yi held the magic sword in both hands, standing still with his legs slightly apart. "Come on." King Arthur held the sword in his hand, not rushing to attack, but walked a few steps around Zhang Yi. He thought to himself, without the power of space as a defense, the only thing he can rely on now is this armor. It gives me a somewhat familiar feeling, as if I've seen it somewhere before. How is it a bit like the one on Ichigard? No, that shouldn't be the case. Ichigard is still in the world behind the gates of light and has not yet come out. So is this a modified version of the armor of the demon god? Well, that would make sense. First move, I'll try something first. King Arthur had already made up his mind. He also held the knight longsword with both hands, flipped his wrists, and a terrifying alien energy covered his entire body. A dense layer of supernatural power gathered on the blade like a storm, and the force was so substantial that it made the sea beneath his feet tremble. Zhang Yi did not dare to be the least bit careless. In his left eye, the pendulum appeared, and the second hand of time monitored the opponent's attack route at all times. Boom! King Arthur moved like a storm, with the speed of thunder. In an instant, he had disappeared from his original position and charged at Zhang Yi, wrapped in a fierce wind. Zhang Yi's legs dug in on the sea surface, and from the body of his demon sword, and from the demon god armor on his body, the hidden source of energy, the crimson energy crystals, began to shine. The powerful energy gathered in the armor on his legs and arms along the transmission channels. Whoosh! King Arthur charged at Zhang Yi. He knew that Zhang Yi could predict the future, so his first sword stroke was nothing fancy, a simple slash that came head-on. Zhang Yi had already anticipated his trajectory and swung his demon blade back. Open! Zhang Yi shouted angrily, and a layer of dark red light appeared on the armor on his arms. There was only a clang as the blade and sword clashed, and a terrifying energy swept out in all directions from the center of the blade and sword. King Arthur was suddenly sent flying by a tremendous force, and deftly tumbled a few times in midair before landing smoothly. He looked in shock at Zhang Yi in front of him, who was still holding the blade with both hands in a defensive stance. But King Arthur suddenly felt his hands tremble a little, and his tailbone to back was cold. For some reason, he had fallen behind in the clash of strength. There was nothing he could do, as his team did not have an outstanding engineer like Liu Karen. The demon god armor could, like the 10 demon gods, achieve overclocking in a short period of time, that is, it could burst out with power far beyond its normal state. Zhang Yi's face was hidden beneath the rabbit helmet, and the cold and hideous appearance directed at King Arthur. When you can't see the face, it gives off an even stronger sense of oppression. King Arthur took a deep breath. He still had 2 more attacks. The first one was just a test, but the next time, he would really unleash his power. Second attack. This time, he had accumulated a lot of strength for a long time, and the strange energy on the knight longsword was so concentrated that it had turned into a huge storm. It was as if King Arthur was holding a supernatural tornado in his hands. His time power can predict the trajectory of my attacks, so this time, I must use the fastest attack so that his body cannot react in time. The demon god armor is tough, but it is not invincible. He had once killed the demon god's body, and although the demon god's armor in front of him was a bit more difficult to deal with than the previous demon god, King Arthur likewise did not use his killer move. With this strike, I don't believe you can hide any longer. King Arthur raised his battle sword high in the air and slashed down at Zhang-Yi. Excalibur. The judgment of a sacred sword strike. The sword energy was like a storm, rushing straight at Zhang-Yi. The storm contained extremely strong destructive power, attacking his entire body from all directions. The sword light was as fast as lightning, and the overlapping sword shadows in the storm were dazzling. It was too fast. The sword was fierce and fast. It was so fast that even Zhang-Yi had difficulty blocking them all. After all, King Arthur himself is equipped with the enhancement and release departments, and in truth, close combat is his forte. Even with Zhou Qir's enhancements, Zhang-Yi's physical body is no match for the man in front of him. But just because he can't react in time doesn't mean his armor can't. The demon god armor is equipped with an intelligent system, and the attack module may not be suitable for fighting mutants, so Zhang-Yi rarely uses it. But the defense module is so useful against physical attacks. All it has to do is block all attacks directed at the user. It's so easy for the machine to do this kind of thing. The red energy module once again exploded with amazing power, and his arms were already as red as glowing iron. Facing King Arthur's attack, which was so fast that the naked eye could hardly distinguish it, the armor itself controlled the magic sword and performed a light-speed defense. The dark great sword in front of Zhang-Yi formed a dense net. All kinds of swings, chops, thrusts, and slashes were perfectly blocked. Not only that, but in the blink of an eye, thousands of collisions were completed. King Arthur had been using the power of his own flesh and blood to collide with the overloaded state of the demon god's armor. It's like an angry bull that wants to charge at someone, only to find that person driving a tractor and charging head-on into it. The moment the attack is launched, it's impossible to stop. The countless collisions in an instant caused the internal demon god body to crack slightly from the force of the backlash. But the demon god body can be repaired again, so Zhang-Yi doesn't feel any pain. King Arthur doesn't get that kind of treatment. With thousands of ultra-high-frequency collisions per second, his palm slowly cracked, and a large amount of blood flowed from his mouth, splashing everywhere. The scene was bloody and shocking. When he finished his move and swept away, he glanced at his right hand again, and his pupil suddenly constricted. Because the sword in his hand was gone, only the hilt remained, and the blade had been completely shattered. His palm was split open, his combat uniform shattered, and blood dripped tick-tock into the sea along the broken hilt, sending ripples out. Zhang-Yi wriggled his arms a couple of times over there. When his defense mechanism kicked in, his body became a little out of control and he needed to stretch his muscles. King Arthur looked up at Zhang-Yi. Which body of a mechanical race demon god was used to create this armor of yours? I have killed high-level demon gods before, but none of them were as abnormal as your armor. His eyes were filled with disbelief. It was no wonder that he felt that way. After all, in his heyday, Ichigard's pure ability index alone was definitely over 40,000 points. The materials used to create his armor were also the pinnacle of mechanical civilization, and no high-level demon god could match them. Even when Zhang-Yi killed him in the beginning, he also took advantage of the restrictions of the rules of the Tianyu Palace, and ultimately bounced Ichigard's own power to kill the spiritual and physical parts of him, without destroying his impenetrable armor. Science and technology are the #1 combat power, Zhang-Yi said with a smile, avoiding the topic. He held up a finger and said to King Arthur, "Now, you have one more chance. One last chance." But, he looked down at the broken sword in King Arthur's hand. "You don't even have a sword anymore. What will the King of Knights fight me with if he doesn't have a sword?" King Arthur said, "No, my sword is still here." Zhang-Yi looked around and asked, "Where's your sword?" King Arthur threw the hilt of the sword in his hand down and placed his right hand on his chest. I have a sword in my heart even though I don't have a sword in my hand. Zhang Yi laughed. Then can you show me the sword in your heart? King Arthur nodded and said, yes. The sword is just a formality. The sword passed down through the Levant family for hundreds of years is just a symbol of kingship. In terms of material, it is not even comparable to today's Edelman alloy. King Arthur stood above the sea, which was as flat as a mirror. Zhang Yi was waiting for him to launch his final attack. King Arthur closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and although blood continued to flow from his right hand, he was strangely calm. When he opened his eyes, his emotions had completely subsided, and his entire being was in the best state for battle. In front of Zhang Yi, his hand really took out a weapon from his chest. But it was no longer a sword, but a huge translucent lance formed from supernatural energy. A sword is only a will, not a form, and that is what it means. Zhang Yi felt the brightness in front of him was a bit blinding, so he squinted slightly and even had to use the Knight of the Rabid Dog helmet to shield against the glare. The next moment, he saw that King Arthur had changed his appearance. He was clad in heavy knight's armor, with a helmet that left only a slit in the shape of a cross exposed on his head. The silver plate mail was knight's armor passed down from the Middle Ages to the present day. The oddly shaped lance in his hand looked just like a large-sized fencing sword. Underneath him, the phantom of a warhorse took shape, carrying King Arthur and standing on the surface of the sea. Is this the posture of the King of Knights? Zhang Yi felt a hint of pressure. Even though he was heavily armored, he was not 100% confident that he could block the charge of a heavily armored knight and the frontal impact of the incredibly heavy lance. After all, the lance was considered a blunt weapon. A sword cut on the demon god's armor would at most leave a mark. But if a blunt weapon hit the body, the armor would not break, and the impact could destroy his internal organs. Zhang Yi narrowed his eyes, knowing that this must be King Arthur's most powerful blow. He must be careful. King Arthur raised the heavy lance in one hand, and facing Zhang Yi on his tall horse, he assumed an attitude of total dominance. Then he tugged on the reins, and the warhorse beneath him let out a high-pitched neigh. With an air of overwhelming power, it strode across the wide expanse of the sea and charged towards Zhang Yi.